Good morning. My name is Rabbi Chaim Dov Belyak. I'm pleased to welcome you on April 7th, 2024, to a program we have entitled Freighted Legacies. This is 6 months since the beginning of the war that's going on in the Middle East, and a very significant anniversary. It has been our custom that we welcome people to our webinars as a way of keeping in touch with our communities. We are constituted as a support program for the progressive Jewish community in Poland. And I want to introduce our chair, Hania Gofranska-Spivak, who is waiting as usual. She's on the go. She's going to introduce herself and bring us greetings from Warsaw. Hania?
Dzień dobry, shalom z Warszawy.
Hi, good morning. Shalom from Warsaw. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in this webinar. I've been the chair of Beit Polska, the Union of Progressive Jewish Community, for 1 year now. So we have Beit Warszawa, the community in our capital. We also have Beit Trójmiasto. Beit Trójmiasto is located in Gdańsk, in the north of Poland, and its members are from the three cities, Gdańsk, Gdynia, Sopot. This is the so-called three-city area. And for those who are maybe here for the first time, let me just say that we also cooperate with the congregation in Krakow, or heders, and our cantor, Iza Rywka Foremniak, leads prayers there, and she's the leader of that community. This is a difficult time both for Israel and for the diaspora. So we are observing this growing need to build a community. There's a growing need to be together. And quite recently we had Professor Susan Heschel here in Warsaw. She visited us for Shabbat. She was here for the second time. And she emphasized that she sees that the role of Beit is important in terms of gathering people. We were reading Parasha Vayekhel, and he gathered. So she emphasized that we, as the Beit community, we are fulfilling this role very well. So this was an extraordinary privilege to hear such words from Professor Susanna Heschel. So that's exactly the community we'd like to be. And we hope that we are fulfilling this role.
Thank you, Hania. At this time, I'm going to turn to just say a word about the program that we call Freighted Legacies. We've been conducting these programs, and they are an opportunity for us to learn not only the history of Polish Jews, but also to learn about the culture, some of the contemporary issues that are facing the diaspora communities that exist not only in Poland and North America and throughout the world, but also to enrich ourselves and understanding some of the challenges that we have faced both historically and in contemporary times. We're very privileged today to have two historians celebrating the completion and arrival to the public of Glenn Dynner's work, The Light of Learning, Hasidism in Poland on the Eve of the Holocaust. While this is a work of history, I can't help but remark that many of the challenges that Hasidic leaders faced after World War I feel have contemporary echoes for us as we think about the challenges we face in a time of crisis. We will refer you to our website for a full introduction of Professor Dynner's work, but simply to say that he's the author of many books, including Men of Silk, The Hasidic Conquest of Polish Jewish Society, Yankel's Tavern, Jews, Liquor, and Life in the Kingdom of Poland, and currently teaches at Sarah Lawrence University. And responding to this new work is a person that Dr. Glenn Dynner, I apologize, has co-written with at least one essay that I found, Dr. Anna Shipokek Garage, who is teaching at my home turf at Arizona State University. Dr. Shipokek Garage is a native of Krakow and is a historian as well, having written a book entitled Beyond Violence, Jewish Survivors in Poland and Slovakia from 1944 to 1948, and other works of historical significance as well. The plan for today is that Dr. Dynner will begin by outlining some of the historical issues. There is a précis that we've posted of some of the issues on our website in Polish and in English. And then after 20 minutes or so, Dr. Shipokek Garage will respond. We'll then invite questions. And I want to be sure that everyone is aware that at the bottom of your screen, there's an opportunity for you to choose either English or Polish as your language. The program is being interpreted in the language that you can best understand. And we want to welcome Dr. Dynner, who is very quick on getting ready for the program. Thank you for being here, and we congratulate you on the release of your book. We appreciate it very much that you're with us.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Beliak. I just want to say, my name is actually pronounced Diner. I should have told you beforehand. So it's actually Glenn Dynner. And
Okay.
Anya's last name is actually Chichopek Gadraj. But
Okay.
other than that, as long as we have all these languages we're having to learn how to pronounce, I thought we should start with names. But of course, all is forgiven, and I really appreciate being here. And I think it's a special honor that Professor Chichopek Gadraj is with us, because what I'd like to do, a little different from what everybody read who received the excerpt, is I would like to start with the main thesis of the book, which is about sort of this cultural resistance by means of Torah study, or devotional study, we can say. But I'd like to then focus on violence, specifically anti-Jewish violence and Hasidic responses, because this is really Professor Chichopek Gadraj's expertise. And I think in the wake of October 7th, we are even more attuned to this problematic. How do you respond to violence? Do you respond with a sledgehammer? Do you respond with negotiation? So all these themes, even though the book had already been written, sort of welled up for me with the events of October 7th. So with your permission, we'll veer onto this side theme, which I think is increasingly a central theme. One more thing about my bio is that I am now actually at a good Jesuit institution by the name of Fairfield University, where I'm director of the Bennett Center for Judaic Studies. So I'm teaching Judaic studies at a Catholic institution, which has also been a real privilege and a venture for me. So if I could just begin with showing a slideshow, I'll just share my screen. Here's a cover of my book. Just get into it'll let me slideshow mode. There we go. And I want to just begin with the image of Jewish life in interwar Poland that historians have fought against for so long. And that's the image that's promoted by such artists, photographers as Roman Wishniak, which is a very traditionalist, poor, studious, and really you could almost say there's a sense of primitive here. Which is supposedly what Polish Jewry was, and Wishniak was trying to kind of espouse this viewpoint in order to raise money for the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. Historians don't like this view at all, and they've sought to combat this whole idea of this is who the Jews of interwar Poland were. Why is this so important? Well, this is our last glimpse at a really flourishing culture before it's destroyed. So it was very important for the last generation of historians to provide a corrective. And I think the two most influential works are by Ezra Mendelsohn and Antony Polonsky, which essentially claim that it was a much more secularized Jewish culture. They tend to emphasize Zionists. They tend to emphasize Bundists or socialists. They tend to emphasize Polonized Jews. And when Orthodox Jews are treated at all, it's only sort of through the rubric, through the framework of politics. That is how Orthodox Jews are legible, especially through the party known as Agudat Yisrael, or Aguda for short. The problem with this approach, I found, is only a segment of Orthodox and Hasidic Jews were actually engaged in party politics. So you're getting really a sliver. And what I've found to be still a slim majority of Hasidic and Orthodox Jews was being almost written out of the history. So that's what I set out to kind of correct in my new book, The Light of Learning. Just to give you a sense of what Hasidism looked like in terms of its influence by the 20th century, this is a map of the various dynasties, and some of them you might recognize, like Chabad is very, very popular today. You can also see Satmar near Hungary, Bratslav. These are some of the major dynasties, but this map just shows you the incredible spread of Hasidism, which I will define as a mass mystical movement centering around charismatic leaders known as rebbes in Yiddish, or tzaddikim in Hebrew. And people would make pilgrimages to their courts in these various locations, seeking blessings, healing, miracles, business advice, matchmaking advice, exorcisms, every possible thing you could think of that would touch on daily life and its intersection with what we might call religion or magic or mysticism. And this is what it looked like as Hasidism entered the 20th century. Now, the 20th century brought with it all kinds of challenges to Hasidism, secular movements like Zionism and socialism and communism. And the movement really did begin a steep decline. And then during World War I, it was really devastated because these courts became scattered and Hasidic leaders were scattered or killed sometimes. The same with many, many followers of Hasidism, men and women alike. So it really did look like Hasidism was going to either stagnate or die altogether. But what happens instead, as I argue in the reading that you received, is a revival occurred. A very deliberate, well planned out revival that centered around study, Torah study, mainly Talmudic study. In more general terms, we can call it devotional study. This was seen as the magic bullet for returning the youth and for stimulating a vibrant movement again in the ashes of World War I. And I argue they were very, very successful because of their ability to institutionalize Torah study. So when they enter the Second Republic of Poland, they enter a Polish state for the first time since, before the partitions at the end of the 18th century, a Polish state that is very assertive in trying to Polonize or assimilate its population. So not only have they faced destruction through physical, destruction by World War I, but they're also being pressured to assimilate. There's mandatory public schooling in the Polish language that they have to contend with. There are all kinds of pressures to speak Polish, dress Polish, and it's interesting because it seems to have the opposite effect in a lot of cases. Now, to be sure, there are many Jews who do try to assimilate and Polonize, but in the Hasidic communities, they really resist it successfully, at least partly successfully. Linguistically, they become pretty fluent in Polish, the youth at least. But the problem with the Second Republic of Poland is it's trying to force Polonization on minorities, not just Jews, but also Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Germans, and so on, in a way that causes these cultures to resist. Jews are especially faced with all kinds of restrictions economically, biases, discrimination, special taxes, attempts to squeeze them out of their centuries-old economic niches. And so there's no real path that Jews in Poland have towards full social, economic, and even legal acceptance. Yes, they're emancipated. They can even have their own political parties in the Polish Sejm or parliament. But even that is very weak and there are limits set on it. So there's not a true path to full acceptance. And in that situation of kind of coerced or forced assimilation, amid ongoing discrimination, I argue, traditionalist movements like Hasidism continue to flourish and even grow stronger. It's a kind of a resistance. So you have, as a result, a very weak Polonizing movement among Jews, and instead you have the kind of creation of subcultures, socialist, Zionist, and Hasidic. And these are very politicized. They have their own political parties, and they have their own educational systems, their own schools. All of this as a way, I think, of trying to maintain their sense of pride in a situation where they simply don't have a path to full acceptance the way you might have in Poland today or in the United States, at the time. And it's really kind of a culture of resistance, as the theorist Stuart Hall refers to it. He's an anthropologist who comes up with this idea that marginal cultures, to resist being absorbed into a mainstream culture, really do create these very vibrant subcultures that, at least in an imaginary way, solve all the problems that they're facing by creating a kind of a bubble or a cultural vibrancy. And what I argue is that Hasidism is actually the strongest one because it's older, it's more visibly different, and it focuses very, very intensely on education. So, in the wake of World War I, before there had been a couple of Hasidic yeshivas, if you could even call them that. A yeshiva, remember, is a Talmudic academy. Suddenly you have hundreds of Hasidic yeshivas, and about a dozen of them, in a matter of a couple of years, become world famous, where people are traveling sending their children to study there from all over Europe and all over the world, the most famous and elite being Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin. And the same is true for Hasidic and Orthodox women who have, for the first time, a school system for girls and young women and a very high-level pedagogical institute in Krakow. This is the Bais Yaakov school system, and there are around 250 schools. Some rise, some fall, but roughly 250 schools, and as many as 40,000 Hasidic and Orthodox girls and women are studying in them. And this, again, was unprecedented. So we're looking at a pedagogical revolution that occurs at a time when most historians had simply assumed that Hasidism would die away. And it changes the movement internally from a movement of courts. And you can see how in the 19th century, some of these Hasidic leaders lived in these extraordinary palaces that had once belonged to nobility. And that's where they had their courts, to where pilgrims would travel. But they become either abandoned because of World War I or de-emphasized. And the new center of Hasidic life comes to be the yeshiva for each dynasty. But some, like Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin, really are trans-Hasidic or trans-dynastic. They can belong to many, many different Hasidic and non-Hasidic scholars. Now, the Bobover Rebbe is one of the most famous Hasidic leaders of the time, as you read about. And I just wanted to include some quote by an important teaching by him that is going to bring us into the problem of anti-Jewish violence. Poland, he argues, in the 1920s, is a kingdom of mercy, run by good people and many respected ministers whose hands extend to act mercifully with us, and it's incumbent upon us to pray for the kingdom's peace. It would be a grave mistake to leave Poland, a place of vibrant Torah study, for a land of great drought, by which he means the United States or Western Europe. A person should never endanger his own soul and the souls of his offspring, not even for a huge amount of money, gold, and precious gems, for who could be sure they would withstand the pressure to assimilate? Preserving the body means little compared with preserving the soul. Now, this attitude is going to carry Hasidism down to the Holocaust. So even as things get more and more dangerous, Hasidic leaders are telling their followers to stay to a large extent. And it's a very difficult decision for Hasidic and other Orthodox Jews to simply leave for safer places because their bodies might be safer, but they're worried about their souls. And they're worried about losing contact with these charismatic leaders and their courts and their yeshivas and this whole vibrant religious life. So down to the very end, most are actually choosing to stay in Poland. And the question I'd like to pose for today with Professor Cichopek Gajraj is, how does violence shape a diasporic community, in this case Jews in Poland, not only through destruction and dispersion, but also by compelling creative responses and formations? In other words, a dialectical Polish-Jewish encounter. Violence is a dialectical, not just a destructive phenomenon. And I'm getting this from Ned Blackhawk's incredible, beautiful, powerful book called The Rediscovery of America, which looks at Native American history in the United States and violence against Native peoples as not just destructive, but also formative, creative for those communities. In other words, we're not just talking about victims, right? Passive victims. We're talking about creative responses. Why is there violence continuing against and really resurging against Jews in Poland? Part of the problem is occupational or economic, where Jews, you can see on the left, are still very, very heavily involved in trade and crafts and otherwise urban pursuits. The general population is still heavily agricultural, but peasant youth are studying now in schools, at least elementary school, right? The Powszechne schools. And they want to enter trade and other lucrative pursuits as well. They're no longer content to just work on their families' farms, which are getting smaller and smaller because there's such a need for land reform. And if you look at the Jewish participation in trade versus the non-Jewish, you see in 1931, Jews, even though they're only 10% of the population, are almost 50% of all trade. And in crafts, it's a lot less, but still it's disproportionate. So Jews are seen as dominating the economy in this way. And some even use the language of the partitions, that we're now in another partition of Poland. This time it's a Jewish partition. Jews are dominating Poland. And that becomes the language of right-wing nationalism in Poland. The current regime will collapse. A nationalist regime is coming. The new regime will expel Jews from Poland. There will be no more unemployment, and Polish workers will at last find work. And I don't need to translate any of this, but these are the far-right movements which are becoming more mainstream, promising to expel Jews from the economy and from Poland in order to make room in the economy for Catholic Poles. And, it's a very kind of visual image of kicking Jews out of Poland. And note that it says Jews go to Palestine, right? This is seen as their place of origin, which is, of course, today so controversial to say. But they're basically saying Jews go back to Palestine. And you can see how racialized the image of Jews are. Jews have these facial features that are different from Poles, the giant nose, the ears, and they're cowardly, they're fearful, and they're fat, they're corpulent because they're lazy, they don't do real work. These are kind of the stereotypes that are accompanying a lot of the very kind of emotional anti-Jewish stereotypes that are being floated about. And it affects the universities. Jewish university attendance declines dramatically, almost to nothing by 1939. And non-Jewish attendance in universities increases. Now, and there are ghetto benches as well, which many of you will know about, where Jews are forced to sit or stand in a certain part of the classroom, separate from Poles. In the economy, there are anti-Jewish boycotts. And in the town of Jedwabne, you can see that the Jewish percentage of shops in Jedwabne declines dramatically because of anti-Jewish boycotts. Also, market stalls decline precipitously. And police reports, according to archival accounts that I compiled from Lublin, police reports show many, many attacks against Jews, breaking their windows, terror, but also against Christians who attempt to purchase from Jews. So this is an attack on a whole economic symbiotic system. There are attacks on Christian customers that are daily as well. They're just not reported very often. Every wagon is controlled and searched to determine whether its occupant had bought from Jews, and woe unto him if he cannot produce a bill from a Christian shop. If not, everything he owns is destroyed, then he's viciously beaten up. As a consequence, he warns others. So Christians are really being beaten up when they try to buy from Jews, and then they warn others. And the boycott starts to work. It's a violent boycott. But of course, the main victims are not Christian customers. The main victims are Jews. There are about 100 so-called incidents, excesses, with many injured and around 50 to 60 fatalities or death. This is nothing like pogroms as occurred in Ukrainian territories throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. And if you know about the pogroms that occurred in Ukrainian territories between 1918 and 1921, you'll know that those death tolls were more than 100,000. So this is not a large death toll, but it's shocking because you have a state structure that's very much intact, right? It's a strong government, a state, and they're not able to maintain order. So when Jews had felt safe, they no longer feel safe anymore. The Pshitik pogrom is the most famous case, the trigger being the killing of Stanislav Wieczniak, and the trial, of course, in which only Jewish self-defense fighters are punished, and the pogromists, including the murderers of the Minkowski, are allowed to go free. And here's a shocking document that Anya has seen before. The Kielce district commander sends this around to the police chiefs about the Pshitik pogrom. The officer acted unwisely and undermined the authority of the police uniform and caused the seeming impunity of the restive crowd by attempting to arrest one of the picketers, the boycotters. Individual policemen should not make arrests during fairs, markets, and similar population gatherings when there is a suspicion that the arrested person has a number of supporters in the crowd who will come to his aid. Now, I didn't go into the Pshitik pogrom for the sake of time, but to understand this, you should realize that it began as an anti-Jewish boycott where a single activist was preventing customers from buying from a Jewish baker, and a policeman attempted to arrest him, and then a crowd gathered and started threatening the policeman, and then they turned on the Jewish communities, and the Jewish self-defense unit of the Zionists actually resorted to bullets and really escalated things, and it became a really fatal pogrom as a result of all of these kinds of occurrences. Now, how do you respond to pogroms? Well, the Americans, the Joint Distribution Committee, they respond with capitalism. We need to rebuild the Jewish communities of Poland, in this case Pshitik, economically, in a way that won't offend the majority culture. And that means less trade and more crafts. Make them into artisans who are less resented by the Polish majority, right? Make them learn a trade rather than working in stores and market stalls. The pogroms continued. Here's a few major damages. Here's a series of photographs that came out, and now that history of emotions has become so important for historians, just look at the faces and you can see the emotions, the terror, as the captions themselves tell us. And then Brzezh, which was a very long pogrom that the police initially didn't intervene because a kosher meat inspector had been stabbed, and they considered the inspector to be one of their own. This is a time when the government was restricting and attempting to outlaw kosher slaughter or kosher ritual slaughter, shechita. Now, what's the result of the Hasidic communities? Build more yeshivas, Torah study, which may sound odd, may sound bizarre, but listen to the logic. The recent brutality must not silence Torah study. Establishing a new yeshiva would be the ultimate refutation of the reigning barbarity. This is Hillel Seidman. In other words, how do we respond to the barbarity of anti-Jewish violence? We respond by institutionalizing Torah study. Now, the decrees themselves against shechita or kosher slaughtering were denounced, of course. The Baba Rebbe decries them as amounting to the destruction of religion through dietary means and the destruction of Jewish communities, since their financial upkeep, including the upkeep of yeshivas, depends on shechita revenue. But behind the scenes, he's meeting with this general, Vinyava, Vinyava Długoshovsky, a little difficult to pronounce for me. And this general is a native of Babova, and he's intervening and interceding in the government for the Babova Rebbe to try to prevent the anti-shechita decrees and other kinds of governmental initiatives seen as harmful to the traditional Jewish way of life. Another thing to do is migration to Palestine, which had always been very ambivalent in Hasidic and Orthodox communities. But now there's a new openness to it. This is Mintzberg, who's an Aguda Sejm deputy. Even if Jewish political sovereignty in Palestine will not mark the beginning of the redemption, as some Zionists claim, it will at least mark the beginning of redemption from troubles and save numerous Jewish lives in the process. So there really is a growing openness to emigration to mandate Palestine. And it may surprise you, when the Nazis do invade Poland and the Holocaust begins, as we call it today, there is some Hasidic resistance of a physical or military nature. Here's, according to this one newspaper report in Germany, we met unexpected and stubborn resistance by a large group of Jewish youths with beards and sidelocks, clad in long clothing, who fortified themselves in the large building of the yeshiva. This is Yeshiva Chochmei Lublin, where they studied and shot at German soldiers from the windows and holes in the walls. Okay, so this did happen. It's just not the main Hasidic response. The main Hasidic response is Torah study in bunkers, in the ghettos. And I've been compiling these, but in the Warsaw ghetto alone, there were at one point 700 Hasidic students studying in these bunkers, and also Hasidic girls and women studying in Bais Yaakov schools, in attics, in basements, in bunkers, and so on. Thus, consistent with this idea that how do you respond to violence? The best way is to study. So I think I'll end the presentation here and open up to discussion now.
So what we'd like to do, thank you, Dr. Dynner, for your presentation. It does open up a number of avenues for us, and I'd like to invite Dr. Anna Shipoka-Gajraj to please respond and invite people, as she is responding, to refer either to chat or to the questions option to begin asking questions. Let's collect them, and then we'll do that after she's had a chance to respond. Please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, both Chaim and Glenn, for your invitation to discuss this really terrific book. It's a great read, Glenn. I really, congratulations. It's a wonderful book. And I couldn't just focus on violence. I just couldn't. So I have 3 praises or 3 points I would like to make. The last one is about violence. And then I will have a couple of questions for you, and then we will open up. So, and I think my first point is important also for the issue of violence, for the theme of violence. And that is your incredible ability to tease out nuance in between historical continuity and change. So as historians, we are very often attracted to rupture, to historical change. When we think about modernity and tradition, we put a thick line in between. But I think you really show us how Hasidim in Poland in the first half of the 20th century, on the one hand, continued their focus on mystical study of Torah, while at the same time modernizing and adapting to very changing circumstances of continual crisis. They learned, and this is a big part about your book, I think, the issue of agency and breaking up with the notion of victimhood and suffering. You give Polish Hasidim agency. You recover it for them in historiography. You show us how they learned to fight for the bodies and souls of a young one, because that seemed to motivated them the most. And they fought both against Zionist and socialist secularization, so against the threat from within, but you also show us at the same time how they fought against the threat from without, from the Polish assimilationist project and from Polish anti-Semitism, from anti-Jewish violence. And all of it they did, and this is truly, you know, brilliant for me, how you show how they proved creatively subversive, reinvigorating traditionalism with modern means to fight the modernization. It's really complicated. But what they did, they used very modern means of cultural, spiritual, and political resistance, right? So they institutionalized education, they mobilized masses, they used party politics, they used mass media, they used press, they pondered using radio, and all of it they did, again, not just to fight anti-Semitism and respond to anti-Jewish violence, but to also respond to the threats from within. And in that way, and you show it really beautifully, how this community proved truly creative, innovative. They truly try to come up with strategies, practices of, you know, perhaps we can call it even survival, right? You don't go that far, but I think we could use that notion from the literature on the Holocaust. Second point, very, very briefly for the sake of time, you just mentioned Bais Yaakov, but I think your treatment, the story of women, is really noteworthy here. You do not relegate women and gender to one chapter. You have astounding material on Hasid women of all ages. And again, you also give them agency in this broader picture, right? You show how they critique, they complain, they petition, they learn, they resist, they engage in politics, they seek romantic love, right? And most famous, like Shara Schenirer, they of course revolutionize girls' learning. But I think it's all of it. So I think your response, your narrative about responses to violence would be really impoverished without all that broader context that you lay out. What this community was, how you say, transformed itself, kind of in the fight against transformation, against modernization, it transformed, reinvigorated, reinvented in many ways itself. And that brings me to my final point, and that is the pogroms, right? Which brings, I think, all of it together, the issues of agency, resistance, revival, cultural and spiritual resistance. I think that's truly where your narrative is most original, in connection with what I said before, with all that context in mind. This is where the most path-breaking intervention in the field is. Because as you know, Glenn, we know the field, and I'm not talking about the field of Holocaust studies, that's separate. This field kind of overshadowed the field of anti-Jewish violence, pogroms. But this scholarship for a very, very long time was either focused on causality of pogroms, consequences of pogroms, dynamic of pogroms, and mostly ignored Jewish responses to that violence. Of course, there have been some important exceptions to that pattern. We had studies of Kiddush Hashem, so self-sacrifice, or scholarship on self-defense, on armed resistance, like in the wake of a Kishinev pogrom of 1903. But this is only really in the last 6-7 years or so that we can see systematic effort to include Jewish agency, Jewish responses, both not just armed, right? Not just with the weapons, but cultural, spiritual resistance, spiritual agency into that study of pogroms. And I think here our field benefited from the Holocaust studies, that you see there a vibrant debate for years about whether organizing Torah study in bunkers was resistance, whether you have to have a rifle to kill a German to call it resistance. And we know that most scholars agree that, you know, cultural, spiritual action could be also seen as resistance, and that kind of, we see how you use that scholarship in your own thinking about interwar Hasidim. What I found particularly interesting was how you think about spiritual pogroms. So how for Hasidic leaders, spiritual pogrom, like a banning of Shchita, was even more dangerous than physical pogroms. You know, it's really striking for me. What's also important reminder, you remind us that it was Hasidim and traditionalists who were the most visible and vulnerable victims, who were often the targets. And I think pogrom scholarship often forgets that. And again, you know, from your context, they responded to violence in the same way as they transformed this community in other spheres of activity, right? With protests, with press, with intercession, delegations, and yes, even physical violence. What I found particularly interesting was that they joined peasants and they joined Bundist workers. So they're secularist rivals in the fight against violence, both spiritual violence and physical violence. So I just want to ask you two questions, which I think bring some of these issues together, or at least they do in my mind. You mentioned in your chapter on responses to pogroms in interwar Poland, you mentioned a distinction between Hasidic quietism and pacifism. You caution us that we should not confuse the two. Could you tell us more about that distinction? And importantly, to what extent this distinction between quietism and pacifism may have only applied to Hasidic elites? You do include voices of ordinary Jews, of ordinary Hasids, but actually the majority of narrative, I feel, focused on male elites who had most of that agency, right? Rebbes, founders of yeshivot, leaders of agudah, writers, etc. So to what extent we can extrapolate, or you can extrapolate, the argument of agency onto the rank and file masses, right? What kind of agency they had? Or is it this is the story of resistance of male elites, educated male elites? And second, more broadly, you are an optimist. I kind of know you by your approach is very, I think you are toward a more optimistic vision of history. You give a lot of weight to Hasidic creativity, innovation, and Hasidic agency. But of course, we all know, and you also write about it, it had its limits. Given the circumstances of enforced colonization, of Jewish primary education, right? Deep economic crisis, the oppressive anti-Semitism. So while it's crucial not to use the hindsight of a Holocaust, right? It's difficult to disagree with Kenneth Moss, who argued in his recent book, Unchosen People, that there was a growing sense of emerging danger and hopelessness as Polish Jews faced the limits of their agency and the overwhelming crisis. Do you perceive a similar awareness or reckoning in the Hasidic subculture? Do you observe a similar sense of doom? Or you see unwavering optimism and faith in providence, despite the violence of the day? Thank you so much for this terrific book, and thank you.
Dr. Dynner, you've been asked a lot of questions, a big question.
So first, I want to thank for that. I think that's a work of art that we just witnessed. I really appreciate that extremely sensitive reading with a very, very powerful sense of the issues that are at stake. I don't think I could have summarized my arguments better than that. So it's a real privilege. And this is probably the best way I could imagine spending a Sunday afternoon, is listening to you sing my song back to me like that. At the same time, gently challenging me in a way that I think is really stimulating and productive. So let's start with the pacifism issue. Now, I don't think that quietism is correct, and that has been, the main assumption, right? That Zionists and Bundists are heroic, they fight back, and the Hasidim and other Orthodox Jews are passive, they're quietistic. Some scholars like Jonathan Boyarin and Daniel Boyarin have attempted to say that that's the more authentic Jewish response, is quietism. And just to define quietism, I think we can define quietism as simply passivity, right? And inability to resist. And I think that is a huge stereotype, whether it's meant as a compliment or an insult. And I think the Boyards are trying to say that fighting back is not the Jewish way. The real Jewish way is the cowering yeshiva student who refuses to fight, and that's beautiful, and it's something that's been lost. There's a nostalgia behind that, and I disagree with all of it to an extent. I think there is quietism, of course, but not as a policy. Usually not as a policy. The policy is not pacifism, but rather pragmatic pacifism. It's sort of like saying fighting back is unrealistic. When you are a defenseless minority and there's so much hostility around you, to fight back is going to probably make it worse. And that seems to be the logic. So we're pacifistic for pragmatic reasons because we don't have the ability to really fight our foes. And therefore, we should follow the example of Jacob from the Bible, who, when faced with Esau, or Esav in Hebrew, first attempts to appease him with gifts and reason with him and negotiate with him. And only as a last resort, according to Rashi, who's the medieval commentator, only as a last resort would Jacob actually fight back physically. And there were Hasidic leaders who really, really followed this formula pretty faithfully. First, you try with gifts and negotiation. And when all else fails, which happened during the Holocaust, some of them really do support partisans in the forest. Some of them even fight themselves, as you saw in the case of the Lublin yeshiva, right? So I think that formula is pretty consistent and ingrained. And it seems like that's what they're being taught. Now there are definitely exceptions. There are definitely exceptions. But if we're going to find a rule, that's the rule, is only resist physically as a last resort. And before that, you go behind the scenes, you lobby, you bribe, you 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 speak gently and nicely, you threaten, you do whatever you have to do to try to influence. You also pray. You also study. This is a form of lobbying God, I think, if you really want to be crude about it. You try to lobby God as well. And lobbying becomes, which we call shtadlanut in Hebrew. Lobbying becomes, I think, the main kind of approach. It's just in this era, which you draw attention to as a transformation and increased agency, lobbying simply becomes more institutionalized. You have political parties, right? You have interventions in the parliament, but it's the same old lobbying that always occurred. It's just in a different form. Now, let me get to your more provocative question, and that is this book, which I inadvertently, unintentionally, was writing against, and that is Kenneth Moth's book. I'm forgetting the title now. It was
Unchosen People.
Unchosen People, right? Unchosen People, where I found myself disagreeing not with the specific examples and cases that Professor Moss gave, but with the generalizations, right? Because he's focusing on mainly participants in the YIVO autobiography contest, right? Who tend to be much more secularized. And if anybody has ever met Yiddishists before at YIVO or other places, you might agree with me that they tend to be a pretty pessimistic group to begin with. Just hang out with them, you'll see. So what I'm arguing is there was a kind of selection here, an over selection that overdetermined the results. Yes, there were Jews who saw the writing on the walls, who were terrified at what was coming, who may have even predicted the Holocaust. I mean, read the great poet Yaakov Glatstein. There's a poem called Wagons. In 1938, he envisions Jews coming out of a wagon, terrified, emaciated, and on the way to their deaths. I mean, that's prophecy, right? Even though he's a completely secular Yiddishist. But my people, so to speak, my subjects, the Hasidim and the Orthodox Jews are optimists. And I think it's possible to make that generalization about religion in general. I think religion is optimism. If we're going to really summarize it, it's optimism. It's the belief that God will help. It's faith. And they really did have a lot of faith. They believed that as long as they were studying and praying, that they'd be okay. But they're not schmucks. They're not naive. They're also at the same time preparing. The Ger Rebbe, for example, makes 5 trips to British Mandate Palestine, where he buys land, he establishes neighborhoods, he establishes yeshivas. They're preparing just in case. He sends followers over there. They procure certificates so that their followers can actually settle in the land of Israel. And they argue that that's a mitzvah, that's a positive commandment, but it's not redemption. God forbid. We're not buying into the Zionist idea that this is somehow messianic, that this is redemption. We're only just being like a little bit careful here, preparing. And that becomes stronger as the violence increases. So I think that's a form of agency too, that is not necessarily optimistic. I would call it a cautious optimism. Like you prepare for the problem is the tragedy is that they really were too optimistic. They didn't I would say emigrate in large enough numbers. They didn't make it the number one priority. They were determined to maintain and revive this extremely powerful spiritual experience that Hasidism had become again. And it was too much to let go of. It was just too great to let go of. Yes, it had changed. And there were even secular classes, secular education in the highest yeshivas in some cases, in Masivta, for example, where they're studying history and geography and arithmetic and Polish poetry. It's incredible. But the core was a very powerful, deeply spiritual Hasidism, which I defined as this mass mystical movement. But if I'm going to refine my definition a little more, it's a mystical movement that claims that God or the divine is to be found everywhere in all things, even the most mundane and negative things. You can find sparks of the divine or sparks of God. Everything has potential for worship. So this Poland, which looks so dangerous and so impoverished, to the Hasidic eye, they just saw divine light. And perhaps that was the reason for their demise, that optimism. But it wasn't a complete optimism. They were starting to really come to terms with the idea of emigration. And they were, intervening, as I mentioned, with the government to try to protect themselves and to protect their communities. So I think that they need to be reconsidered as tragically wrong, but not ridiculously wrong, not absurdly wrong. It's just that nobody could really predict the extent of the destruction.
I want to intervene, first of all, to thank you for this wonderful dialogue between the two of you. And I want to suggest that perhaps also the lines between a person that was raised in a Hasidic home and is now labeled as a Bundist or is a proponent as a Yiddishist or a Zionist is not as hard a division as we now see it. I come from a family of Ger Hasidim, and we see in the generations the wide swath of people that are moving, even in their own lives, across the spectrum from Bundists to Yiddishists to revisionists, etc., so that they embody sometimes all of those politics in the same month, the same year, as they react as persons and participate in what is going on. So these are things that are constantly in movement. I also want to ask, because we are a progressive community, the leadership, at least publicly until 1935, are progressive Jews. Rabbi Ton and so forth are the official face of the people that participate in the representation in the parliament. They are officially Zionists, but they're, at least as best we can tell, in communication with broad swaths of the Zionist Hasidic community. There's not the sort of siloed sense that we have today. While there's differences, the communities and there's certainly struggles but going on. There seems to be communication, at least on the leadership level, across the various sectors of the Polish Jewish community. I'm wondering what either of your reactions are to that.
Well, so if you're talking about the blurring of boundaries between these political groups, yeah, I think is very much the case. And just proof of it is a single family could have a son who's a Bundist, a daughter who's a Zionist of the left wing, a daughter who's a Zionist of the revisionists, a good Hasidic son, and so on and so forth. So you couldn't really have as you refer to it, as a siloed community, the way it looks when you look through as a historian. I think also there's a big difference between life in a city like Krakow, where Ton is, the rabbi, and there's much more coexistence of necessity in a big city than you would have in a small town where Hasidim are dominant and the Zionists are seen as wayward youth, even heretics, So it really depends on a lot of factors, but I'm glad you raised those blurred boundaries. At the same time, I want to caution that they did become very, very fragmented because, number one, political parties and youth groups, right? That was a very kind of strong divider between friends. It could even end friendships. And also their educational systems. You could go to a completely different school if your parents were Zionists versus socialists or versus Hasidic. So the schooling could be different. And what that does is it impacts the daily life, the social life.
There's a question from Professor Patalon in Polish that I translated into chat. If you want to look at it, it's either in the Q&A or in the chat. And there's also a question from David Cater. Take either one.
The military service, it's important to get into the mentality, right? Military service in traditionalist communities is seen as like a death sentence, not because you'll die in the battlefield. It's a spiritual death sentence. Traditionalist Jews, they would maim themselves, they would injure themselves so as not to have to serve in the military. It's not that they're disloyal. It's that it's almost impossible to remain religious or traditional after having served what was often 25 years in the military, and it was destructive in two major ways. Number one, beyond religious, it was destructive socially because husbands would come back having served in the military, and they will have forgotten all their Torah studies, and they're engaged in all kinds of questionable activities like gambling and drinking, and they could be physically abusive to their wives. So there was that problem. There's also an economic devastation that happens. Imagine losing 25 years of training and experience and accumulating, economic opportunities, which you would have if you just went straight to work. So there were all kinds of reasons why the military was seen as undermining the traditional Jewish way of life. There were some, nevertheless, and I have examples in my book, who were drafted and went and served in the army during World War I, and even remained religious, remained Hasidic. It did happen, but no one ever spoke of it as a positive experience. It was usually pretty traumatic, where you have officers who are deeply anti-Semitic, and if you try to maintain your religious appearance or behavior, you're even more of a target, and this is what you see. So it was really seen as an assault on the traditional Jewish way of life, and I think that's carried over into modern Israel, where the Haredim are actually treating the Israeli government as if they're the same thing as the Polish government back in the period we're talking about. They're seen as almost as non-Jews who are going to draft our sons in the military when they should be studying in the yeshiva. So that's kind of the tension, and I'm not sure it will ever really be solved.
Thank you. That's an important clarification. I think there was another question by David Cater that didn't get responded to directly, though it's encompassed in a good deal of the conversation that went on between Anna and Glenn. How does the Hasidic remnant post-World War II understand this strategy now? I guess, the strategy of saving the soul versus the body.
Anya, please feel free to jump in anytime. I just since this is more my subject, I figured I would just have the chutzpah to answer. So okay, so first of all, give me one opportunity to repent. I at the end of my sort of response to Professor Gadraj, I said that they were wrong, but not absurdly wrong. But that's looking at things with our Western kind of lens, our secular lens, which is the most important thing is to survive, right? To physically survive. I'm not so sure many Hasidic Jews felt that way back then, and even maybe today, that survival is the most important thing. Perhaps it's more important to simply study day and night in a ghetto, in an underground yeshiva bunker, and die. I mean, maybe that's the correct choice, the proper choice, rather than make all the compromises that you have to make in order to survive. And there were many compromises that people made to survive. I think Anya could also address this too. I mean, you could not be a tzaddik and survive. People did terrible things to survive. People gave up their religious observance to survive. Maybe survival was not the main goal. So I just want to put that out there because I think it's so hard for us to really accept. But that's the reality. I think of any religious person is martyrdom is preferable to somehow destroying your soul, and your chance in the afterlife. And that's a mentality that we need to try to really understand. Beyond that, is the soul more important than the body? The soul is always more important than the body, but don't be a fool about it. Try to preserve the body as much as possible so that the soul will actually be able to be enriched and enlivened through the activities of the body. There's not such a separation here. That's why Hasidism primarily was against what we call asceticism, right? Self-denial through fasting and torment, physical torment. There was much more of a, I would say, lenient view towards the body in Hasidism, where it's better to serve God when you're well fed, when you're singing, and when you're dancing, and when you're experiencing joy. Now, that translates into a kind of mentality where you don't simply reject the body or deny the body. And that's an argument for actually emigrating if you're in Poland in 1939. And many Hasidim did. We have to remember it wasn't so easy to leave, It wasn't so easy. But there were very powerful attempts, including the Baba Rebbe himself. He migrated very quickly into Soviet-occupied Eastern Poland, eventually making it to Lviv, where he was finally overrun by the Nazis and killed. He had a chance to flee, but he didn't want to leave his son behind. So you see how difficult and complex it is. That's not really martyrdom. That's a sense of priorities. I want to make sure I'm there for my son. I want to survive as long as possible. But in the end, if this is what God decrees and I have to die, then this is the will of God. So I think we do have to even look at that in a more nuanced way.
And just to state the obvious, right, that having lived living in Poland in 1937, 38, 39, you also had very limited information of the day, right? There was no hindsight of what's going to happen in 5 years from then. So the judgment is absolutely impossible.
These are very sobering and important perspectives. We tend to judge from the mass media and the internet media, and we need to be cautious. The question of what is the ultimate significance of life and why we live is to be judged not by one scale, but certainly Hasidism brings us to a different set of measurements. I am hesitant to close this conversation, but we are already about 15 minutes over our usual closing time. I am grateful to both of you for this wonderful opportunity to learn. I would say to open a chapter. I neglected to say that while we have pursued several lines of inquiry in our Freighted Legacy program, this is the first in a series of programs that will pursue the inquiry into the modern and historic importance of Hasidism. Recently, we opened a line of inquiry into the progressive movement, which has been sorely neglected in the historical work. There are just a few historians working in Poland, Dr. Galas and Dr. Ronen in particular. And so we're trying to highlight their work. I wanted to say that we continue with these Freighted Legacy programs because we think that there are adult learners. Some of them are children of survivors, but many of them are people who are traveling to Poland and who are interested in understanding that this important history, and I want to here raise the point that the questions of the different ways in which American Jews were invited to think about the Polish past often were shaped by questions of fundraising and nostalgia and many other questions that Dr. Dynner raised very delicately and very lightly for us, and that Freighted Legacy is committed to thinking about these things in greater depth. So we will continue, and we will be having a number of significant conversations. I look forward to reversing roles here, where we will invite Anna to be the presenter and Glenn to be the responder. I hope many times in the future. We have such riches in both of you, and we thank you. Congratulations to Glenn. I understand there's always challenges in getting the book out finally, and there were some in this instance, and we're glad that it is out and it's available. If you click on the link, you can get to buy the book, and it's actually out and available now, and we hope that people will actually read it. The sophistication, while shared by the author and the interlocutor is present, there are many, many more levels that we couldn't get to in this short presentation. I invite you to go further. I want to now turn to a couple of things, and that is that on May 12th, a delayed program will bring us to a program that we had originally planned earlier, but will allow us to finally hear from Joanna Torska-Bakir, who is visiting at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Her recently released book, Cursed, A Social Portrait of the Kielce Pogrom, in its English version, has just been released, and it is about a period after the Holocaust, July 4th, 1946, and the interlocutor will be Professor Jan Gross. That will be at 10 a.m. Pacific time, and we again will be presenting that in Polish and in English. We invite all of you to join us. I would also at this time like to thank our chair, Hanya Govranska-Spivak, very loyal interpreters, Marzena Szymanska, our former chair, Marek Yuzovsky. But let me conclude by again thanking our panel and wishing you a Zisen Pesach, a sweet Passover. Thank you once again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.